Hello and welcome to The Society with Fatma Shaheen at PTV World. Now, despite the fact that child corporal punishment remains to be one of the most common forms of violence in children, not only in Pakistan but worldwide too, we do see that unfortunately this social evil at some level or the other finds some validation in our Pakistani society. How does it relate with our social cultural norms? What are those general, mindsets which actually perpetuate this social evil? This is what we'll be talking about in our today's show. We'll be discussing child corporal punishment as it does exist in the society today. We'll also be talking about the various impacts it does have on children, or for that matter anybody who's actually subjected to the same. And in this regard, we'll also be talking about the laws, the policies which must ideally exist to curtail the same. And last but not the least, we'll also be deliberating upon the fact that when it comes to prevention, what are the necessary steps that we need to take both at a policy as well as at an institutional level in order to ensure that, we stop our children from falling prey to child corporal punishment. This and much more to follow on today's show, and to do that, let me introduce you to my today's panel. My first panelist for the show today is Dr. Naeem Zafar, who's a pediatrician alongside being a child rights activist. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. My second panelist for the show today is Ms. Mehak Naeem, who's a social scientist. She's also an educationist. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. My third panelist for the show today is Ms. Fatma Zahra, who's a psychologist and she's also a trauma survivor. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
And via telephone line, we'll be joined by Ms. Rabia Malik, who is a policy analyst. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Now, to get the conversation started with you, sir, I think we must address the basics first. When we talk about child corporal punishment, what all does it entail? Does it just entail the fact that, a child is basically subjected to any form of violence physically, or does it also entail any form of verbal abuse?
Thank you, Fatima. I think let's first define what corporal punishment is.
Right.
Because for our public, it is supposed to be beating, hitting, smacking a child, or even demeaning him or her in the name of disciplining him.
Right.
And that is not necessarily done at the school. It is done at homes, at workplace, or wherever.
Right, sir.
So once we talk about that, which means that the person who is beating the child is actually proposing that he's or she is disciplining the child and doing it for the child's good.
Right,
and
sir.
that's where the whole problem starts, because this has been known to be a part of, as a component of child physical abuse.
Of course, sir. It's such a blatant form of violence.
So whenever we are hitting a child, whenever we are beating him, especially if we are beating them with any pedestal, any, whatever you think, any hard object, so then it is considered as physical abuse. But once we name it differently, and corporal punishment is probably a better name, because then other names are also exist, which try to justify it, and that causes a lot of confusion.
Right, and I think it is practically the mindset that we need to work on, that mindset which basically perpetuates and also validates, this form of violence. But coming to you, I think we must also talk about this in a more broader way, more so considering, the fact that child abuse at the end of the day, child corporal punishment in whatever form that may come, that can also, kind of be in the form of words too, because a lot of times we see that, children are abused, and that may in turn actually cause them to suffer psychological harm. So where do you draw the line, Mehak?
When we are talking about corporal punishment, again, as Dr. Naeem has already mentioned, the person who's perpetrating it is probably a caregiver, a person who is very close to the child. So automatically when a child is listening to or is being beaten, his trust automatically from a very early age, he has problems with trusting people, and there are other factors that get involved. The problem that lies when you're talking about corporal punishment, that in our society we think that it's okay to say little things that we're saying it just as a joke.
It's okay to spank a child.
It's okay to spank,
and it's very natural to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And when you see around, I'm not just talking about people who are horrible monsters. I'm talking about people who are in our close circles. They think that it's okay as a corrective measure to discipline a child via physical or verbal punishment. So that's where I think we need to understand that it's not an outsider issue. It's something that it's very prevalent in our society. It's very prevalent in our own culture.
Right, Mahek, your point is noted. On which I'll come to you, Ms. Rabia. You know, when we are talking about this, of course, we cannot miss the social context of this, because at the end of the day, as has been, been pointed by my panelists, and rightly so, this is a social issue. So when we talk about this in the social context, and you from the viewpoint of an educationist, do you not feel that it would be putting a lot of burden on the teachers, especially when they don't have the requisite skills, that knowledge, or even that level of sensitization to actually think of, alternative methods to discipline children, rather than, of course, using, child corporal punishment?
Right, absolutely. So teachers need to be provided support. They can be told about which practices are effective and which are ineffective in achieving the goals that they themselves want to achieve, but also teachers need to be supported by the system also. So in addition to training and capacity building, which you're referring to, which is absolutely very necessary, our classrooms also tend to be very overcrowded. So we need to think about how many teachers per classroom, but also what kind of support in terms of human resources do teachers need. So do teachers also need support teachers or interns, etc., within classrooms that can help them manage large classrooms?
So, madam, in your opinion, then this is something which then expands, outside the purview of teacher training per se. It's also, of course, about human resources. It's also about the way, the teachers are trained, and more so even, they are monitored, so to speak, because you see, this is a vicious cycle, and if we need to address this issue, of course, there are so many stakeholders involved that we need to give all of them equal attention.
Absolutely. You raise very important points. So now Pakistan, almost all provinces in Pakistan are collecting data on teacher practice without criminalizing teachers necessarily, or without putting all the burden on them. If we can start to signal in ways that are also positive for them, that certain practices are more rewarded, that they actually result in better outcomes of learning and child development, then chances are their behavior will slowly start to shift. Now, behavioral shifts take very long time anyway, but those kinds of changes, if first of all, if you can record practices, collect data on them, remove the stigma from talking about them, and positively nudge in a direction that shifts away from this practice, also give teachers the resources, activities, as well as lesson plans, etc., that allow them to try different practices, then you'll begin to see change.
Right, madam, and I think the most important thing in this is to actually make them realize the fact that, at the end of the day, child corporal punishment per se is not the most effective way to discipline children, on which I'll come to you. I think you can talk about this from your own real life narrative, being a survivor of child corporal punishment. So what do you feel are the most, pressing reasons because of which we see a rise in this social evil, more so in the past few years? Because, every now and then we hear of cases on the news, or for that matter, coming forward on social media.
So in my personal experience, what I have learned is that the narratives that's built around corporal punishment is very interesting. First of all, we need to look at the narrative that's built around corporal punishment.
Which justifies it, which validates it. I think that is something which both of them also raised, that, it's something which unfortunately gets that validation from the society.
Exactly, but if you look at the psychological impacts and the psychological ramifications of corporal punishment on nervous system of an individual, researchers suggest that the impact does not only last when the child is going through it, but even after the danger is gone, the individual still suffers from the consequences.
Is that something which happened in your case as well?
Yeah, and in the words of Dr. Basil van der Kolk, he says that body keeps the score. At the age of 26, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, and I believe actually that even though the abuse stopped, the corporal punishment stopped, but 7 years later, unfortunately, I was diagnosed with adult onset Still's disease.
So it's something which manifested later onwards, but let's hope it doesn't stay with you for the rest of your life, and you are struggling against it. I know you have been taking therapy for it.
Exactly, and I've been vocal about it, because I think so many, I've worked with people who are suicidal. I work with people who are struggling with mental health problems. problems. And if we really dig deeper into their childhood,
right,
I haven't found a single person in my life who hasn't gone through that. And
right. And I think it takes a lot of courage to actually speak about it at the end of the day, because I think this is something so rampant in the society that I think so many people go through it, but there are very few who actually want to talk about it. But from your viewpoint, for the clarity of the audience, tell us that, how did it come about? Was it something which emanated from your household? Was it something which came from the school?
So first of all, I would like to say something, that why I want to talk about it. I've been vocal about it on social media as well. The thing is that in my work with people who are suffering from suicidal ideation, there is a very strong correlation between suicidal ideation and corporal punishment.
Right.
So there are so many people who are not here alive yet, alive to tell their stories. So when I listen to them and when I make that connection, I feel like it's my obligation to, speak about it and really tell the world, because this is something, there is so much shame attached to it, there is so much humiliation attached to it.
I think that is something which is common to the Pakistani society, so to speak, because whenever anybody is subjected to violence, most of women, I think victim shaming comes at the end of the day. So I think it takes a lot of courage, like I earlier said, to speak about such issues. But sir, coming to you, I think we must also talk about the fact that you've been in this field for so long, you've practically dedicated your entire life to child rights, so to speak. But how do you see the trends changing over a period of time? What are the predictors now of child corporal punishment, and what are the associate factors of the same?
Well, if you're talking of the secular trends, I must admit, when I started off, and that was in the late 90s, when I joined this league, we were very reluctant to talk about corporal punishment.
Right.
We were talking of severe child sexual abuse. We were talking of commercial exploitation. Because the moment we brought out the subject of punishment, there was a lot of contradictions, there was a lot of controversies. Everybody was saying, why are you bringing a topic which is so natural to us? Why do you want to discuss it? And they actually, they shunned off. They just shut up. They didn't, they stopped talking to us. So that is why I still remember when we started our trainings and capacity building sessions early in the 2000, I'm talking about 2003, 2004, we tried not to bring the topic up.
Right.
Because it will hamper our other work, because we were trying to establish hospital-based child protection committees and developing systems.
It would throw you off track that way.
Yes. So it would, yes. And so that is why we did not talk about it. But I'm happy that now at least we can talk about it openly.
Not only people like us, people like her, I think so many people from the society, we now see celebrities talking about it. I remember, a year ago, a very famous singer, Shahzad Roy, he actually filed a petition in the Islamabad High Court to get it banned, and he got relief from the court that way. So I think it's really good that, all stakeholders are now on the same page regarding this, very pressing social issue. Meg, I'll come to you. I think we must also talk about the fact that, when we talk about this, that, when we see people actually subjecting children to corporal punishment, whether it's parents or for that matter, whether it's, teachers in schools, what are the reoccurring traits that you see in them as a psychologist too? Because I know you're a psychologist as well alongside being a social scientist. And do you feel that there is some level of commonality amongst these traits?
So basically, when we're talking about someone, for example, who's already witnessed corporal punishment, there you see a lot of intergenerational transfer of violence. So basically, if, for example, a person has been beaten up as a child, he feels that it's okay for him, and he feels that somehow as a part of his coping mechanism, he feels it's okay, and hence sometimes he or she transfers his corporal punishment to the child via whether he or she is a teacher.
It's a vicious cycle at the end of the day.
It's a vicious cycle. So it's basically about justifying, the person justifying the act to himself, that whatever happened to me was okay. So, and also believing that it was normal. It was not something abnormal that happened.
Right, Meg. But coming to you, Ms. Fatma, I think we must talk about this from, your survivor's angle too. When we talk about this whole issue, I think we must also consider the fact that, whatever trauma, of course, the survivor, or for that matter, the victim suffers, equal is the trauma of those who actually witness it. So coming from the horse's mouth that way, somebody who's been through this, how do you see this, both in terms of the psychological impact as it comes onto you as a victim or / as a survivor, as well as to the impact it has on people who are witnessing this incident?
So first of all, we have a term for it in psychology, that's vicarious trauma.
Right.
So people who are witnessing it, that they are vicariously traumatized by the incident. So first of all, that's very important. That just like they say,
it's just like we have vicarious liability.
yeah, and smoking, you know, passive smoking.
Right.
So just like that. And sometimes people who are witnessing the trauma, they might have more impact than the person who goes through that.
Right.
Yeah. So I have my experience in madrasa, I have my experience at school, at home, and I'll say that a lot of times it was a vicarious trauma because I was a star child. I was A+ student. I was taking positions in madrasa, at school, everywhere.
But why did this happen in the first place? You know, the general trend we see, you know, whether it's something which emanates from parents or for that matter from, you know, schools, is that they feel whoever is actually committing this act feels that, you know, you're not complying with the set rules and regulations, you've done something wrong, and by hitting you, they're setting the record straight, they're actually disciplining you. So what particularly happened in your case?
So in my case, I think it was more about disciplining the children. It was about it's for our good, you know, that's why they're doing it. And a lot of times it was because I grew up in a nuclear family and there were only 2 people who had to take care of a lot of kids.
Right.
So the thing is that one of the factors that I think that in nuclear families, the couple, the parents, they have to manage everything by themselves, and kids somehow they become the outlet of the aggression or the frustration that they are going through.
Right.
So you know, kids are the soft target for their displaced anger, you know, that
I think this is something which goes back to what you were saying as well, that it's a vicious cycle. I think some way there is that lack of having a smooth relationship with your child or a tension-free relationship which actually contributes to this. You wanted to add something to this, Meg?
Even in joint families, I think we've seen a lot of cases where the mother is very frustrated because of the household work, because of the joint family pressure, and that automatically comes out on the child.
Right.
So on the surface it looks like corporal punishment because of disciplining, but there is an inherent frustration that is basically the mother's frustration or the father's frustration.
Or for that matter, I've seen so many cases where couples don't get along, and that is something which comes in the form of child abuse or child corporal punishment coming out of them. Yes.
So basically, the way I see it, it's the parents' inability to regulate their emotions.
Right.
You know, like just like addiction, just like compulsive buying, you know, all of these things, people do it because they don't know how to regulate their emotions. So if a mother is frustrated and a father is frustrated with whatever, with business, with household responsibilities or whatever, if they're not able, if they do not know the healthy ways to regulate their emotions, so they will end up hitting their child and
that's, you know, how they take it out basically.
Yes.
Your point is noted.
And
so yes.
We can also add another thing to it, and that is domestic violence. So if there is a strife between the mother and father in themselves, and there is an abusive element to it, the children on the one hand are witnessing it, but on the other hand they are the ones who are finally being subjected to torture of any kind, from the father as well as from the mother. So that is also. Another point that I wanted to make was that it is actually cultural.
Right.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, when I was in the school, in my school, and which was the elitist of the schools, there was a concept of caning and brushing and hitting as a means to discipline, and you know, the school teachers and the school administration took pride in it.
Right.
That such and such child will be taken to the principal for caning on such and such date. There was a date fixed for caning. So now that those things have changed.
Right, but I am glad that, you know, slowly and gradually things are changing, and of course for the better, on which I'll come to you, Mr. Abhay. I think all the 3 panelists have raised some very valid points on which I would want you to deliberate further. Now this is something which we see is unfortunately being perpetuated by our social norms, by our culture per se at the end of the day. But when we talk about sensitizing parents, how precisely do you feel can we do that? Because, you know, parents, if you talk to them, they feel that, you know, this is something which happened to them, so it's okay if they pass it on to their children too.
Thank you very much. No, those are very, very powerful points, particularly the personal experience. So there's 2 or 3 points I'd like to make here. First, I think documenting children's experience, bringing children's voice into the conversation, bringing the voice of the people who experience this into the conversation as narrative, as almost evidence, is very, very important. As witnesses is very, very important. We may not be able to change 100% of or address 100% of the reasons why this happened, but listening to all of your esteemed panelists, it's very, very clear that a lack of understanding is feeding belief about the effectiveness of this practice. And the lack of understanding is minimizing or trivializing the impact it actually has on a child's mind, on a child's life. So bringing out children's experience coupled with trends, global trends as well as trends within our country. So it has to be measured in order for it to become visible, first of all. So certain, not only I think policy actors, but I think civil society actors have a very important role to play in documenting these narratives and bringing them to a public forum.
Right, madam, your point is noted, on which I'll come to you, sir. I think we must also talk about this in the context of, child corporal punishment as we see it, in orphanages, as we see it, happening with special children who, of course, might not have that mechanism or that ability to say no or to report it. So, in cases like these, how can we improve the system per se so as to make it more accessible to such children, so at least they can, come forward and talk about it, or for that matter, report it to the relevant authorities?
If you're talking about the global policies, if you're talking about the policies, we can look at the global trends, and we see that there are different levels of banning corporal punishment in different countries. So there are different laws related to corporal punishment in the homes, in the schools, in orphanages, in institutional care children, in children with disabilities and others.
Right, sir.
You will be surprised, I am not, that Pakistan falls among those countries where none of these have been implemented. There are 62 countries in the world who have implemented all. There are more than those countries who have implemented partly, but few countries who have not done so. Although in ICT, which is Islamabad, and in Sindh, there have been some regulations, some rules, but it is not there. Now, when we are talking about corporal punishment, and now coming back to your question, when we are talking about marginalized populations, right, such as children with disabilities, children in the prisons, children in the orphanages, and others, these are in any case the ones who are worst affected.
Of course.
Because there is no supervision.
Right, sir.
There is nobody to look at them.
This is why I raised the question.
So, yes, what my point is here is that if we look at the children who are normal, in right, normal families, and we change the trends there, the trend in the orphanages will automatically be, right, will get better. But yes, the legislations have to be made, and the people who are committing this, they have to be taken to task.
Right. And sir, I think not only that, they not only have to be taken to task, I think we need to advertise this more, because a lot of times we see that, even people like her who have actually been trauma survivors, they don't want to talk about it, even if they've successfully gotten out of it, or for those who are actually committing such crimes, even if they are put to task. I think that's something which is not highlighted, which doesn't give people hope.
Another very small point. When we are talking of corporal punishment, we are actually thinking, when we talk about it, we are actually thinking of a little smack, a little hit here and there. We have seen children die.
Of course.
And these news have come in the newspapers and in the media, that the children have died because of hitting in the schools. The children have died because of hitting the domestic servants, have died in the homes. And just the point that Fatima was making, I was learning there is a very important study which I would like to highlight here.
Please.
That is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Now this states that there are 10 types of adverse effects that they have counted, and among them the most important is physical abuse and sexual abuse and physical neglect and emotional neglect, right, and others. So they lead to severe disruption in adult life, not only psychological but also physical, which has manifested in Hestel's disease here.
Right.
So this is so common.
Of course.
And let me talk about another very important area. when a teacher starts hitting a child, or when the child and the teacher starts admonishing a child, the first thing he does is he blocks the child's explorative things, he blocks the child's understanding. So the child resorts to the rote system, which we are already doing. I still remember as a child, I was one of those very few who would raise my hand and ask a question. And every time I would do, the teacher would get back to me in a very, very harsh manner. And ultimately, my friends, my students along with me, they would put my hand down.
Right, sir, and I think this is something which she very rightly so mentioned as well, that how witnessing such acts of abuse, acts of corporal punishment, they can also of course have a very negative impact on your psychological health. But I'll come to you, Ms. Mehak. I think sir has raised some very valid points, and focusing particularly on the laws and the policies. Last year we remember that this very progressive bill was passed in which it was said that corporal punishment is going to be banned, and then we have had even celebrities advocating for this cause, going to the High Court and then getting it banned at least to the extent of Islamabad. But practically, when you see this at a nationwide level, how do you see these laws and policies being implemented per se?
So when we're talking, as Dr. Naeem has already pointed out, we're talking about different systems. So at homes, we haven't really talked about corporal punishment at homes. When we talk about most of the policies that are happening in Pakistan, we're talking about corporal punishment, banning corporal punishment at schools. So when you're talking about schools, again, as the conversation we've already had, that a lot of our teachers are not trained on positive disciplining. So even 5-7 years ago, there was a slogan in Urdu which talked about how you should love a child rather than hit a child, and it was on every gate, every school building. However, when we're talking about with teachers and we're talking about how you're managing classrooms, there is a huge problem with they don't know what to do. So when we're talking about implementation, we have to take a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach to look at how we can implement our policies, and obviously for that we need to have notifications in place,
right,
TORs in place,
right,
and that's really missing.
Right, Mehak. On which I'll come to you, Ms. Rabia. I think Mehak has raised some very valid points, more so us wanting to adopt, or rather aiming to adopt, more of a multidisciplinary kind of an approach to address this problem. So when we talk about it, at least at the levels of schools, what would your recommendations be that, in terms of adopting internal policies, what are the things that schools need to look out for? Because of course this at the end of the day is a local problem, it is a grassroots problem. There is no denying to the fact that it has the potential to be regulated by laws which, nationwide apply across the board. But at the end of the day, I think if we kind of administer it at a local level, that will be equally helpful too. Because if you see, there are so many cases of harassment against women happening, and so many organizations, so many companies have, zero tolerance policies towards the same. So can we not expect something of the same sort, especially when it comes to, penalizing child corporal punishment in Pakistan?
Gee, those are good points. I have a feeling that you'll probably achieve more in terms of implementation if a positive nudge approach is taken. So all 4 provinces in Pakistan, or all 5 of them, have made a lot of progress on building mechanisms that stretch all the way down from the provincial level to the school level that can now support teachers. So you have district level training, you have coaches that go and observe and support teachers in classrooms on a regular basis. I think it's very, very possible. I'm completely in agreement with your panelists that this needs to be, in a very big way, part of all teacher training materials. There needs to be a very specific module on this, which needs to be developed by people, who've been thinking and have the evidence on this. But delivering that material from the provincial level as part of a policy program that stretches all the way down to the school is very, very possible. We've seen many examples of different kinds of programs where that has worked. So I'm very optimistic that the infrastructure exists, and now the material needs to be developed and made part of training mechanisms. Secondly, your school leaders are going to be very important champions, your agents, people that you, or as a policy, as people who are thinking about mobilizing support for such a reform, will have to work with, because school leaders have a lot of influence on teachers that work in their school. Giving school leaders autonomy and allowing them and showing them ways in which they can nudge their teachers in a positive direction is very important. Again, 100% of this may not disappear, but you might be able to reduce the percentage and proportion of such practices quite significantly by doing this.
Right, madam, and I think in this regard, you yourself have again raised some very valid points. I think the monitoring is the key. We need to be constantly monitoring such policies too, because at the end of the day, you know, anything, any law on policy on paper would just have some empty rhetoric value till the time it is practically implemented. And for that, I think at least at a local level, we need to work on our monitoring mechanisms too. I'll come to you, Fatma. I think people like yourself, you know, somebody who has been a survivor of trauma, and then somebody who is a psychologist today and, you know, doing so well for herself and her life. So what are the lessons that you've learned all along this way? How can, you know, professionals like you, healthcare professionals, contribute to, you know, eradicating this social evil from the Pakistani society?
So basically, I'm a fan of this theory that's called post-traumatic growth, that says that, you know, trauma has the potential for growth. So I believe in taking that approach, that, you know, trauma isn't the end of life. It could be start of something very beautiful if one is able to reach out to resources and the help that's out there. So the way I see it, I see a lot of hope. For me, I think I wouldn't be a psychologist if there were the kind of mental health professionals that I wanted to have when I was a teenager. So basically, I got into this field because I think in the field of psychology and psychotherapy in Pakistan is really needs such kind of professionals who put their souls and their heart into the field. So for me, it was more of a necessity then the thing.
But maybe, you know, another way to look at it is the fact that, you know, maybe you can add a better dimension to it, considering that, you know, you have been through it, you know what all it might entail possibly, and then accordingly you will be in a better position, a more informed position to treat your patients too.
Yeah, so in the words of Carl Jung, he says that wounded healer can truly heal. So I feel that, you know, I do not have only read the theories of psychology, I have experienced them.
So you can definitely treat your patients better.
Definitely, alhamdulillah, and I have
and I'm sure you are doing that already.
Alhamdulillah, my work is in over 25 countries, alhamdulillah, and my voice is being heard. I write on social media, on my Facebook, and yeah, a lot of people are saying that this is something that they resonate with.
Your point is noted. On which, sir, I'll come to you, and coming towards the conclusion of the show, I think, sir, it's very important that we also tell the audience about, you know, how we can, as a collectively a society, work towards prevention of, you know, child corporal punishment, because it is something which emanates from the society. So, you know, it would be very commonsensical that, you know, the solutions also come from the society.
I think, and also because corporal punishment, as we have just learned through our discussion here, is a cultural thing.
Right, sir.
So we have to, if we want to eliminate it, we have to change the cultural paradigm. And for that, awareness and capacity building are the two most important things.
Right, sir.
Let me just give you two examples. What we are doing. In 10 districts of Punjab, Pehchan is conducting capacity building sessions and trainings and psychological sessions, and we are developing school child protection committees. We are doing community child protection committees, hospital child protection committees, all three making a child protection network with the government institutions, including the Child Protection Welfare Bureau, including the Social Welfare Department, Health Department, Education Department. So we are trying to model something, a pilot in 10 districts of Punjab, and giving the model to the government that this can be done.
This can be replicated.
And it has to be replicated through the there are school councils already present in the government schools. We can work through them.
Right.
And the second part is, which is extremely important, is the role of positive parenting.
Of course.
So we have developed over the last 4 years, Pehchan has actually developed a series of workshops, capacity building sessions and social media awareness regarding promoting positive parenting, promoting positive disciplining techniques. So whereas we can tell the parents that there are alternate ways of
disciplining a child. And I think, sir, in this regard, it's extremely pertinent that we must mention about early childhood program, so to speak, something which is, comparatively new in Pakistan, although we do see it, being very prevalent in the Western jurisdictions, something which actually allows children to improve their relation with parents and vice versa, so as to, not let them be subjected to violence.
Well, in our parenting programs, we start from girls' adolescence, going to her pregnancy, and the first 2 years as well. Because it is in the lap of the mother that the child starts observing things. And then the moment the child starts crawling and walking, so what happens then? So the parenting actually starts very early on and it continues on and on.
Right.
And we have to give them very positive messages and very easy messages. So we have actually started a community group, Parenting with Pehchan, on the Facebook, where the communities can discuss it among themselves, and we are there to moderate them and give them better solution.
Right, so on which I'll come to you, Ms. Mehak. I think we must also talk about this from the youth perspective, because we've generally spoken about so many other perspectives. How do you feel can Pakistani youth in the society today work towards, eradicating this social evil? Because we do see Pakistani youth otherwise being so active on so many other social causes.
So I think there are two aspects to it. One is that we need to make sure that the cycle breaks here, because mostly young people are of an age where they're going to be parents to be. So whether they have experienced some sort of trauma in their childhood or not, they should not carry this forward to their children. So for example, what we've been doing over the past couple of years is training youth about general principles of alternative disciplining, or general principles of how it's important to, when we're talking about child rearing, to look at the long-term result rather than just the short-term. So one thing that needs to, one thing we need to focus on is on how we're integrating this knowledge in our curriculum, etc., at university and school level, so that cycle breaks here.
So, then you're asking for something which is bigger than that at the end of the day. But of course, it has a direct impact on the Pakistani
the education system, it can be academic institutes, but it can also be non-formal channels, such as social media. Social media is a very important tool when we're talking about mobilizing youth. Second thing, when we're talking about advocacy, youth plays a very important role because they're the voices.
Right. Fatma, I think what would your message be, because you do have a very important place in today's panel, considering that, you have had that courage to talk about this issue so openly and of course on national television. What is your message to all those, children, young adults, people who do unfortunately fall victim to, child corporal punishment? Why is it so important for them to break the silence and to talk about it openly?
First of all, I would like to say that without therapy, I wouldn't have been able to talk about it. It is only because of psychotherapy, the trauma that I've processed in there, that I have that courage now today. So first of all, I would like to say that, whatever they have endured, whatever they have suffered, get some good professional help so that they're able to make sense of it.
Right.
I used to write before therapy, and that writing had a lot of reactionary approach. Okay, so I would talk about it, but it was coming from a lot of pain and resentment and reaction, and I don't think that's very, that wasn't very productive, I guess. So when I write about it now, I come from a place of very different place. It's not revengeful, it's not reactionary. I understand what's going on behind the scenes.
In that regard, the credit also goes to you, of course, yourself, because you have also been able to bifurcate it, you've been able to understand it, in some ways internalize it, but for the better, because a lot of times we see that, victims who are subjected to violence, they internalize violence, but they don't do it in a way which would be better for their growth. So I think the credit definitely at the end of the day goes to you, on which I'll come to you, Ms. Rabia, and coming towards the conclusion of the show. My last question to you would be that, whereas of course we do talk about working towards eradication of child corporal punishment and, condemning it in whatever way we all can as responsible members of the Pakistani society, why do you feel is it equally important for us to positively work towards, social well-being of children too? Because at the end of the day, we as a society must, ensure that children not only, survive, they also thrive.
So I just want to say that while it's very important that, a safe environment completely absent of any negative threats is present for children, because it's being proven again and again now that that's what works to allow them to learn, to allow them to study, and to allow them to think creatively and positively. Explicit focus on positive investments in our children. So apart from removing the negative threats, positive investments in their socio-emotional well-being in schools is becoming a very big part of the discourse in education policy. So thinking about their creativity, thinking about confidence, thinking about problem solving, all of these things have very large communities of practice at the international level as well as national level that are generating evidence about how much benefit such investments make in children, that I think if you were to think about coalitions between people who are working to stop corporal punishment, and there are lots of people from very diverse backgrounds doing that, making coalitions with people who are thinking about socio-emotional learning and positive investments, you have a very strong voice, a very strong group of people who are advocating for the kinds of environments children need to live in. And if we are serious about links, look, education matters and your human resources and human capital matters because it matters for development. You have a youth bulge. As much as you positively invest in them, not only will they be able to be very productive members of a global community, they'll also be very productive citizens of your own country. And to make those links explicit is what needs to be done. I'll stop here.
Right, madam. So basically you mean to say in a nutshell that the change, of course, must not only come from, one particular part of the society. It's something which must, of course, emanate from all quarters of the society. And this, thankfully, I believe we are doing, because even when we talk about this, we see that, so many people, human rights activists, lawyers, courts, people from the civil society, even healthcare professionals, they are very actively advocating for this cause. On which note, I would like to conclude today's show. Thank you so much, Dr. Saab. Thank you so much, Ms. Mehak. Thank you so much, Fatma. And thank you so much, Ms. Rabia, for being here with us today. Well, to conclude today's show, we generally spoke about child corporal punishment as it does exist in the society today. Whereas, of course, it is important that we have necessary laws and policies in place in order to curb it. What is more important is to challenge that mindset which actually one way or the other validates it, or for that matter perpetuates it. And this is exactly what we need to work upon as a society. In this regard, it is very important for us to understand that, child corporal punishment is not the most effective way to discipline your children. The best way to discipline them is in a more peaceful manner. We need to understand the fact that, children, they need to be respected, they need to be given the due dignity that they deserve, because at the end of the day, this is their fundamental human right. Thank you for watching The Society. Until next time, take care and Allah Hafiz.